Hello, and thank you for having me as a part of this symposium. I have to apologize that I wasn't able to attend in person. Unfortunately, it just wasn't possible, but I am grateful that I can still participate virtually. It's perhaps appropriate considering the nature of the Sentinel project and our technology work, and of course the topic of my talk, which will also be focusing on some aspects of technology and atrocity prevention. So I still, that being said, have to say that I regret not being able to participate in more of the symposium and meet everyone and see what sort of other topics are being covered. But hopefully next time I'll be able to be there in person. So that being said, I will move on with my talk. It's probably important to start off with some points about the Sentinel project, just as background. Since I'm not there in person, I don't know exactly what kind of introduction I've been given, and I want everyone to know where I'm coming from, in terms of context and the work that I do and that we do at the Sentinel Project. So our full name is the Sentinel Project for Genocide Prevention. Though we have the word genocide in our name, I should mention that we are broadening our mandate from genocide to include mass atrocities more generally. Our mission then has become to actively assist people worldwide, wherever and whenever they're threatened by mass atrocities. This effort, this mission really contains two main pillars, prediction and prevention. That means that our work focuses a lot on the creation, the development of an early warning capability, as well as the ability to implement preventive measures. And we aim to take a holistic approach to that mission. Key components of our early warning work include analysis of structural risk factors, basically preconditions that have been identified as predisposing a given society to have genocide or mass atrocities take place, as well as the monitoring of genocidal processes based on Gregory Stanton's 8 stages model, which we've sort of adapted for our own purposes and fit numerous indicators into that we can apply and look for in different situations, what we call situations of concern, or SOCs for short. I might use that term a few times. So we're also very interested in bringing together both a quantitative and a qualitative approach, because we see these two as being complementary rather than mutually exclusive. So it's really about, the Sentinel project is really about taking different approaches in terms of quantitative and qualitative and structural factors versus sort of a process-based means of analysis, and putting those together. And in terms of implementing all of that, we have a really diverse team, and we're drawing on expertise in fields such as intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis, disaster management, engineering, computer science, political science, history, these sorts of things. So throughout all of the work that we do, in addition to those sort of two pillars that I mentioned, two other key elements of everything that we do at the Sentinel Project are incorporating innovative technology and also striving to cooperate with threatened communities. Our goal really is to work below the state level rather than targeting states, be it North American or European governments, which might be able to intervene in a pre-genocidal situation, or or a potential perpetrator government. We are not interested in targeting those state governments to try and influence their behavior. The Sentinel project is intended to work below that level, directly with the people who are actually in harm's way. Just to give you an example, before I go on with the sort of the bulk of my talk today, I'd like to give you some examples of recent work that we've done. So a couple of months ago, we launched a tool called HateBase. You can see it at hatebase.org. It's actually intended to be the world's largest online repository of hate speech. So this is one of our technology projects, obviously. and allows people around the world to come submit hateful terms or examples of harmful language, and then log sightings of them if they've been called something or heard someone called it or even used a certain term themselves. So it's crowdsourced in that sense, and then also works. It has an automated side to it, which scans social media such as Twitter, for example, and then logs sightings based on that, based on online activity and online use of hate speech. And the idea is that this data can eventually be linked up with other types of early warning data that we use in order to add context to those. Another technological project of ours is Wiki, which is our situation tracking software that our analysts use for managing data that we've gathered, managing those indicators of the genocidal process, and then visualizing them, ultimately with an eye towards being able to recognize trends and patterns and do long-term, long-term or forecasting. We've also recently done some field work in Kenya, where we were election observers during the general election earlier this year, as well as doing some field work in the Tana Delta region of eastern Kenya, and that's something I'll come back to shortly. We've also launched a training course on using technology to defend human rights, and once again I should mention regarding Tana Delta that we're actually planning a project in that area, which I will elaborate on a bit, in order to map the origins and flows of misinformation, and then to actually test counter messaging to stop, reduce the risk of violence due to misinformation in Tana Delta. So to get into the main body of my talk, I'd like to build upon that last point that I mentioned about the Tana Delta. That actually ties in pretty well with the topic that I have, which is the role of technology in localized early warning and prevention. What I'll be covering now is less about work that we've already done at the Sentinel project and more about work that we're starting to do in this area and plan to do in the future. So essentially I'm proposing some concepts and some things that we're starting to formulate and looking forward to actually field testing hopefully in the near future. So if you're familiar with the Sentinel project at all, you might notice that most of our situations of concern, or SOCs, are listed at the country level, essentially. We have, countries like Azerbaijan, Iran, Burma/Myanmar, Indonesia, and Colombia. Kenya is sort of breaking this mold. We did start a couple of years ago listing Kenya as an SOC due to the post-election violence from 5 years ago and the risk of that recurring in 2013. Fortunately, it did not. But we've actually changed focus now because Kenya does appear to be stable. The country has essentially passed the test of the general election relatively peacefully. And instead we're refocusing on a subnational region with the Tana Delta. So this small region in the eastern part of the country is located in the eastern part of the country as part of the Coast Province. And it really represents the first time that we've moved towards this subnational localized early warning and prevention work as well. And this is going to be part of a general trend within our work. I can imagine that it's eventually all of our SOCs are going to go this way, so that rather than focusing on entire countries, which are rather diverse, we'll focus on subnational regions. And what this means is that we'll be gradually tightening our focus, both in terms of geography and also chronology. Ideally, what we want to do is get to the point where instead of just being able to say that country X is likely to have mass atrocities take place in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be able to say that city, town, or even neighborhood X is at risk of atrocities within the next 3 to 5 weeks, days, or perhaps one day, even hours. And this means that we can actually give far more actionable warnings to the people who are in harm's way. If this information is shared with them correctly, then they themselves can act accordingly to prevent, avoid, or mitigate violence in whatever way is most appropriate for the situation. Now, such ideas have already been used in natural disaster management situations, which is an area where I have a bit of a background. And these efforts are taking an increasingly people-centered approach. So there's no reason why the fields of conflict prevention and conflict early warning and atrocity early warning and prevention shouldn't do the same. We're a little bit behind the curve on this when you compare our work to, for instance, people in natural disaster management. Now, this might sound like an ambitious goal, and in fact it is. However, it's a worthwhile one, since, as we all know, the majority of conflicts are now intrastate, and many of the atrocities that accompany those conflicts are in fact committed by non-state actors as well as state-based actors. And most countries also are very diverse places. Thus, it's not enough to simply have a general sort of macro level knowledge of a country as a whole if one is going to be doing early warning and prevention at the local or micro level. To use the Kenya example, there are 42 different ethnic groups living in Kenya, all with their own particular context, their own particular relationships to each other, local sort of complexities, local conflicts, and so on. And it's not, we realized that we weren't going to be very effective, especially not as a small organization, going in and saying, Kenya itself overall is at high risk of mass atrocities, because there wasn't much we could do beyond that. The Sentinel project is not going to fix all of Kenya's problems in terms of ethnic rivalries and potentially violence. However, in a place like Tana Delta, where the problem is fairly self-contained in a relatively small area with a relatively small population, we actually do have potential to affect that. And it's much easier to become well-versed in the local sort of local nuances and complexities than it would be for a country as a whole. So very likely we'll be doing the same in other SOCs, such as in Burma, Myanmar, with the situation of Rohingya Muslims, which a lot of people are probably familiar with now in the western part of the country. In Azerbaijan, the particular subnational region we're interested in is actually the breakaway ethnic Armenian Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. And for instance, in Indonesia, West Papua would be the region we're likely to focus on. So bringing it back to Kenya and the Tana Delta, I want to give a bit of background on that as well before I elaborate on our plans. So this is a fairly little known and generally ignored part of Kenya, and this is unfortunate because Tana Delta actually saw a series of ethnic massacres from August 2012 to January 2013. Fortunately, these were, as far as ethnic massacres go, and things that we would classify as atrocities or mass atrocities go, fortunately these were relatively small-scale massacres. In total, approximately 150 people were killed. Some tens of thousands were displaced from their homes. They're starting to be resettled in their homes now. But what we see is, of course, a significant distrust remaining between the Orma and Pokomo ethnic groups, which were the two belligerents involved. Now, there were a lot of existing problems before this time, but it's really the March 4th general election just a couple of months ago that started to instigate or escalate a lot of the tensions in the area as local politicians started sort of playing upon ethnic rivalries and a lot of long-standing grievances in order to play the two groups against each other and gain some sort of political benefit out of that. Now, fortunately, because the election has passed and the government has taken a fairly proactive or taken a fairly proactive stance towards Tana Delta in terms of deploying security forces and so on, things have been relatively peaceful. But a lot of the underlying causes are still present. And so there is the potential for escalation. Unfortunately, when the international media has given the Tana Delta some coverage of any sort, it's been fairly basic and generally simplifies the situation as the typical sort of age-old conflict between farmers and pastoralists. In this case, the Pocomo being the landed farmers and the Orma being the cattle herding pastoralists. Now, there is some truth to this, of course, but the reality is far more complex. So we conducted an admittedly very brief field visit to the Tana Delta area during our time in Kenya, and we met with people from both the Orma and the Pocomo communities. And one of the things that stood out was the seemingly powerful role of misinformation in the area. Both sides, both ethnic groups naturally see themselves as victims and have serious misconceptions about the other. One elder spoke favorably of the Rwandan genocide and placed his own ethnic group, sort of cast them in the same role as the so-called brave Hutus, who he said stood up to Tutsi oppression and did what they had to do in Rwanda. The implication being that the same sort of situation could unfold in Tana Delta because his people would have to stand up for their rights and potentially destroy their ethnic rivals in order to defend themselves. Naturally, this was a pretty alarming thing to hear, especially when we have an environment with a lot of young men hearing a lot of rumors that their own group is being targeted and are more likely and are therefore a lot more likely to launch preemptive attacks on neighboring villages. Just as a couple of examples of the rumors that we heard, one was that an outside power of some sort had supplied one of the sides with 3,000 AK-47s in order to drive the other off the land and destroy them. Another recently was that a government vaccination worker or a government health worker administering vaccines in the area, who was from one ethnic group, had supposedly swapped out the vaccine with poison and was trying to poison children from the other, from the other ethnic group. Is this true? It seemed very unlikely, but the important thing is not whether or not these allegations are true, but that some people actually believe them and then act upon them. So this is why we've chosen the Tana Delta as the ideal testing ground for one of our ideas about localized early warning and prevention. Now, because we haven't done everything at once, we've chosen to focus in on the seemingly salient issue of misinformation, how it originates, and how it can be countered. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about things like localized or short-term early warning, this is a very ambitious project. The same is true of the project to map and counter misinformation. So the question then is, how do we overcome significant challenges involved here? Well, the short answer to that question, well, there is no short answer to that question, quite simply, other than to say with creativity, hard work, and persistence. We do, however, have a powerful tool with some of the technologies now available for this kind of work. And I should note that I'm definitely not a techno-utopian who thinks that things like internet access and mobile phone access and big data automatically lead to democracy. Technology is definitely not a silver bullet or a panacea. However, we do have to acknowledge that we live in a time of unprecedented opportunity, really, with close to 4 billion mobile phone subscribers around the world and over now, I think, 1 billion internet users. The information communication technology, or ICT, now reaches into many of the most remote, least developed, and most conflict-ridden areas in the world. So what we actually have, theoretically, is the ability to reach out and talk to almost anyone in the world almost instantly. And this is a capability that we didn't that did not exist even just 2 decades ago. Now, early warning at any level, whether it's national, regional, or local, is going to be very heavily data-driven. And these technologies that I just mentioned give us the ability to gather that data if we're smart about how we do it. What we can then do is recognize trends and patterns in order to make forecasts about future events and make informed, intelligent decisions about how to prepare for them. Think of the potential if we were to link together tools like HateBase and ThreatWiki along with data mined from the web and crowdsourced from people on the ground with mobile phones. Just imagine the first time that we recognize a clear correlation between spikes in hate speech or statements by influential leaders and violent incidents against persecuted minorities. What happens? We start being able to make educated guesses about the future, turn those guesses into actionable warnings, and rather than sending them to fall on deaf ears in national governments or international organizations, we broadcast those warnings directly to the people whose lives are at risk. Of course, we have to be very careful to do this so that we don't actually exacerbate the potential for violence in some way, which is a significant risk that needs to be taken into account. Now, this is a project that's absolutely full of complexity and risk, but it is worth trying. Our first steps will be, if we can, of course, secure the support and the resources, to set up our misinformation mapping system in the Tana Delta, and then test the ability to not only map misinformation, but also to broadcast counter messages to the population using mobile phones, which are quite widespread in the area. Beyond that, we'd like to take the lessons that we get from that project and incorporate them into work elsewhere around the world, hopefully with the assistance of partners. So, of course, we are looking for partners in this work, and we welcome anybody who would be interested in taking part, whether they're organizations or individuals. So I am going to close sort of on that note, hopefully having given uh, a good introduction to why it's important to move from national level early warning down to local level early warning, to become proficient at this, and to include members of threatened communities in it, as well as to have highlighted why technology really does provide us with the opportunity to do this in a meaningful way for the first time ever, and to do it in an intelligent way. There are lots of risks and complexity and challenges that go along with it, but it's absolutely worth doing because we really do have the potential to use these tools at our disposal in an innovative way and actually save lives by preventing or mitigating mass atrocities. So, of course, I'm unfortunately not there in person to answer any questions that people might have. I really wish I could be, but I encourage you to get in contact if you've been interested in what you heard here, if you want to work together, or if you have any questions. Our website is www.thesentinelproject.org. Please do visit it. And my email address is simply chris, C-H-R-I-S, at thesentinelproject.org. So please, like I said, don't hesitate to get in contact. We'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.